Hi, everyone. Welcome to the grand finale episode for 2023 of Democracy Dialogues, the place to get beyond the headlines to discuss what's really happening in the Americas. I'm your host, Eric Farnsworth, for over 2 years coming to you on the first Thursday of every month on YouTube and also our website, as-coa.org, breaking down the most pressing regional democracy issues. Now, as we wrap up this year, we're diving into the big moments that shaped democracy in the Americas in 2023 and what might be lurking in 2024. And guess what? We've got a heavyweight right here in the house with us, a true hero on these topics, José Miguel Vivanco. He's been in the game for over 30 years, stirring the pot for the rule of law, human rights, and democracy in the region. For many years with Human Rights Watch and now with Denton's Global Advisors and also an adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, José Miguel is with us to unpack the highlights and lowlights and where we go from here. And he's also a personal friend. José Miguel, thanks for joining us here at Democracy Dialogues.
Thanks a lot for having me.
We saw a lot of changes in democracy in the hemisphere in 2023. As we come to the end of this year and look ahead to 2024, what sticks out the most for you? What were some of the most dramatic developments, and what does that portend for the future?
The trouble is that most of citizens in the region are losing faith in the system, and that is extremely dangerous. The main reason why they're losing faith is because they see different political parties, different options that alternate in power during the last 20, 25 years. And leaders promise to fight against corruption, poverty, promise to develop a strong economy that start growing again and creating opportunities and employment, improving public services, health, education, and so on and so forth. And the balance at the end of every term is quite mediocre. And so they feel deeply disappointed, on the whole, mechanism that has been running the region for the last 30 years. That is extremely dangerous because when citizens don't see an impact in their own life and their daily life with the democratic system, and that means participation in elections, supporting political candidates in Congress, and so on and so forth, conditions are usually pretty much easy for populist political options that present themselves as anti-establishment and potential, presidents who could take decisions, make decisions, and in simple terms, just in 100 days or few months, deliver for those ones who are, deeply disappointed.
Is this a disappointment in specific leaders who haven't been able to deliver on campaign promises, or in the system of democracy itself? What's your sense? Is there turning against democracy, or is it, we see in election after election that candidates who are not part of the ruling party are elected, but they are being elected. People aren't overthrowing elections. How do you see that?
Look, I think this phenomenon is not just a regional one; it's global.
Yeah.
And this disappointment with the electoral democracy, with democracy in general, and so on and so forth, But in Latin America, clearly is impacting left-wing candidates, right-wing candidates, center candidates. Everyone is, I think, judged with the same type of rule, and there is a lot of impatience. People want to get results in a relatively short term, and political candidates usually promise results just by the first 100 days, and if they don't have that capacity, which is normally the case, because this progress in democracy is slow, is gradual, and democracies are pretty much per definition divisive and messy and short-term oriented. Well, that creates anxiety, and that I think is the perfect conditions for options that are actually authoritarians, are not democratic, and are based on usually the charisma and the connection of those leaders with the people, with the electoral.
One of the things that you've been very clear about in terms of your own distinguished career has been that democracy is not a one-size-fits-all issue. Each country implements democracy in different ways, and we see democracy implemented differently around Latin America. And that gets to the question that I want to ask in terms of a very timely issue right now, the Israel-Hamas crisis, conflict. We've seen different reactions coming out of different democracies in Latin America. I wonder if you have some views in terms of what explains some of that divergence, and what might we anticipate going forward in terms of Latin America's response to the Israel-Hamas crisis.
I think it's, in spite of all of these years of experiencing public debate, democratic process in the whole region, and globalization in terms of providing reliable information, and as well as unreliable information. But the world and Latin America is more integrated to the rest of the world, and in spite of all of that, something prevailed in the region, which is for some political sectors, this sense of being still anti-imperialist. And when in Latin America you use that concept of anti-imperialism, they're not thinking about Russia, they're thinking about Washington and the US. So there is some sort of kind of automatic reaction to something that when the US government, and it could be Republican or Democrat, takes a firm position in global affairs in other regions, many people in the region is suspicious, and they usually take a kind of ideological approach, and that I think is clearly reflected in the conflict in the Middle East as well as in Ukraine. It has been very difficult to build up some basic support for the case of Ukraine in the region. Only few leaders have been willing to take a principled position. And many of them, even though it's a dramatic case of violation of the sovereignty and basic international principles in question as a result of that invasion, there are many countries, including large democracies, I'm thinking about Brazil and Mexico, that are sort of confused about who is right, who is wrong, and insist that Ukraine, for instance, has some degree of responsibility in this case where is clearly the victim.
This is the
same thing applies for the Middle East. The reluctancy to clearly and unequivocally condemn the atrocities committed by Hamas in Israel is unfortunately a reflection of preconceptions and ideological bias by some governments in the region.
This is a fascinating point that you're raising, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to clarify. I mean, we're not talking here about Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba. We're talking about divergencies in democracies in Latin America, no? And what you're pointing to, I think, is a fascinating discussion of how even countries with democratic governance are coming out looking at the world in a different way, and that has obviously implications for broader policy issues going forward, no?
Correct. And it seems to me that the option to clearly condemn terrorist activities by a terrorist group like Hamas in Israel, as well as to condemn with the same energy violations of international maritime law committed by Israeli forces that are responsible for killings of civilians in the Palestine, in the Gaza territory, should be a reasonable option for any democratic leader in the region. But unfortunately, ideological bias prevent many of them from taking a firm and clear position in this particular conflict, as well as I said before, in the case of the invasion of Russia in Ukraine.
We're here with José Miguel Vivanco talking about the developments in regional democracy in 2023 and what we can look forward to in 2024. José Miguel, we've got a lot of elections coming up this coming year in larger countries like Mexico, smaller countries like El Salvador, and lots of other countries in between, not to say Venezuela, of course, and even the United States. If we have this conversation at the same time next year, at the end of 2024, and we look back over the preceding year, what would you anticipate we'll be talking about then? Is this electoral cycle going to be one of general, even-handedness, where the systems will work and the results will be respected? Will we see something new in terms of the presence of social media or the potential manipulation of voters from outsiders? How do you see the election cycle that we face coming up in 2024?
So far, what we see in the region is deep disappointment with democracies in the region for their incapacity to deliver.
Yes.
That is, I think, is a fact. As a result of that one, citizens are using electoral democracy, in other words, elections, to reward or punish the incumbent government. And since results are quite mediocre, normally is the opposition the one who wins the election. That is I think, a simple and short explanation about this shift in ideology or ideological position from, let's say, Lula to Bolsonaro, Bolsonaro to Lula, and the same thing for Argentina and Chile and many other countries in the region. The problem is that quality that democratic system in Latin America is clearly using, and is the capacity to do some sort of self-correction as a result of public debate, is to some extent in danger in the region. In other words, the fundamental principle to respect the results of elections.
Yes.
And secondly, to support and strengthen and respect the mechanisms that many countries in the region have created to control that the elections are fair,
yes,
and the results are not, a product of electoral fraud, like, for instance, the case of Mexico, which has done a lot to protect the vote of the citizens. If we enter into a new phase where the results are under question, like it happens with Bolsonaro in Brazil, Or in the case of Mexico, the current government is taking every possible step to dismantle the mechanisms, the institutions that have been created to prevent electoral fraud, or the case of Bukele in El Salvador, which is running for re-election in spite of clear language that prohibit that option in the Constitution.
In the Constitution.
But since he has full control of the whole system, not only Congress, but also the judiciary, he's able to do that because he's also very popular. Then we are going to enter into, I think, a phase that is unfortunately going to be much more delicate, much more dangerous for the future of democracy in the region.
That independence of judicial systems is so critical, isn't it? And you've just referenced it with regard to El Salvador. I recall the effort by then President Alvaro Uribe in Colombia trying to change the law to allow himself to run for a third term, and it was the Colombian judiciary which prevented that. You yourself were very involved in that effort and played a very, in my view, important and critical role in that regard. But that's an issue that we see increasingly at risk. No independent judiciaries across the region that are not co-opted by the ruling party or the executive branch.
Normally, one of the first steps taken by leaders with authoritarian tendencies are to go after the free media, civil society, and the judiciary. The judiciary is key.
Yes.
No? If the leader is able to undercut the independence of the judiciary by, intervening, changing the rules of the game, changing the composition, in violation normally of the Constitution, the composition of the Supreme Court, for instance, or creating an extra mechanism that is not contemplated in the system to supervise the judiciary, including the Supreme Court, like, for instance, Correa did with some degree of success in Ecuador. That is pretty much the beginning of the end of a democratic system.
So if you're an outsider from Washington or Brussels or Tokyo or anywhere outside Latin America and you're concerned about these issues, what role can the international community play to help strengthen these institutions? I mean, these are domestic issues, and the influence of outsiders is by definition limited. I mean, you've spent a career trying to advocate for some of these reforms and then support for democratic institutions. In your experience, what are some of the best, most effective things that outside countries or institutions or NGOs can do to support the democratic process?
I think international community, as we normally call, but specifically large democracies, Western democracies, should, if they can, support everywhere in the world, but particularly in the region, free media, civil society, and independent judiciary. And the independence of the judiciary is, again, history, the recent history of Latin America shows that it's absolutely critical. I can give you so many examples of countries where the leader, normally an authoritarian one, decided to intervene and to control the composition of a Supreme Court, and as a result of that one, pretty much everything else became just the exercise, the will of the leader. And that is, for instance, the case of Chavez in Venezuela after 2004. He, with a slim majority that he had in Congress, he decided to change the composition of the Supreme Court from 20 justices to 32. And the new 12 justices were all of them members of the ruling party, of Chavez's party. Since then, the Supreme Court of Venezuela has always, since 2004, sided with the government and helped the government to legitimize whatever decision they made.
That's a pretty impressive record of success of the government.
Absolute success. Is and that is the model of Bukele in El Salvador. That is what the president of Mexico is attempting to do. This is so critical that I think there is consensus in Brazil that the reason why Bolsonaro was not able to do more damage to Brazilian democracy was precisely because the Supreme Court of Brazil stopped and defended the Constitution of Brazil when Bolsonaro had the most anti-democratic initiatives in place. So if something that probably not many people is aware of is that the Supreme Court of Argentina, the entire Supreme Court is under impeachment procedures promoted by the current government of President Fernandez. And that means that there are constant hearings in Congress requesting informations about the record of the Supreme Court in multiple and many different issues, in essence, second-guessing without any specific information, second-guessing rulings of the Supreme Court of Argentina. That obviously undermines not only the independence, but also the credibility of an entity that is supposed to function as the last resort to protect the Constitution, freedoms, human rights, and so on and so forth.
Well, think about it in the human context, too. If you as an individual are being asked to weigh in on some very politically complicated issues as a Supreme Court justice, and you have this threat of impeachment hanging over you like the sword of Damocles, that would have to weigh on your mind in terms of your rulings, one would think. Again, just at a human level. I mean, these are very powerful manipulations of the system, influencing of the system. I want to ask you about a country specifically which should have elections in 2024, but that still remains to be seen, I guess, Venezuela. And the question, you've done so much work on Venezuela, so much powerful, good work, but the institutions in Venezuela at this point, I would suggest, are 100% captured by the ruling regime. You have had the primary. Maria Corina Machado was the clear winner. I think that surprised the regime. The question is, now that there is a process in place to get to elections, what's your confidence level that we can actually see in Venezuela in 2024 the elections that the regime has promised in a way that could be seen as relatively free and fair? Do you give any percentage to that at all? And if so, what can the international community do to expand that percentage to make it more likely, even if it's not guaranteed, but more likely that you could have a successful electoral process?
I'm very skeptical about the case of Venezuela. I think it's any reasonable observer should conclude that the likelihood that we are going to have fair and free elections in Venezuela that challenge the dictatorship is very slim. And so the role of the international community is central. And I have been always, in my whole life, professional life, many, many years in Washington, in favor of engagement, not in favor of isolation. So this is a time for key democracies in the world to closely engage with the opposition, with the government of Venezuela, in order to create some, leverage, and it is important to avoid the temptation to just forget about Venezuela and isolate Venezuela as a lost cause. I think this is a critical moment to exercise gradual but consistent pressure on the dictatorship, using the tools that the EU, Canada, the US has at their disposition, probably not sanctions, but diplomacy, to create the space for the opposition to operate. And lastly, the opposition has the fundamental function and role to exercise their limited freedom peacefully in the country. If anyone believes that we will make a transition from dictatorship to democracy in Venezuela only thanks to this international pressure, I think is not realistic.
José Miguel Vivanco, these are some wise comments, and as we draw to the close of this session, I want to give you a chance to look into 2024 and give us what's the optimistic scenario here in terms of democracy. Are there things that we can look forward to in terms of developments in the region and things that we can celebrate with the people of Latin America as they continue their democratic journey?
Look, I think it's hard to be optimistic about Latin America for all the reasons that we have discussed today. But certainly, if we have an exemplary electoral process in the U.S. where we are facing presidential elections, and if the main parties involved in this competition are play according to the rules, and we are ready to accept and respect the results of the election, something that sounds very simple, but is still an issue in the U.S. That example certainly could influence the region in the positive way.
Yeah. José Miguel Vivanco, thank you for those comments, and more importantly, thank you for joining us here at Democracy Dialogues. I hope we have the opportunity to have a conversation again in the future.
Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you to all of you for joining us here at Democracy Dialogues and for your support throughout the year. We look forward to seeing you again each month in the coming year. Until then, let's continue to work together to ensure that democracy delivers for all of us.